Spring brings new tidings and expectations. Snow melts, and life reaches up to greet the warmth of the sun. New leaves mean trees are ready to fell to the Viking shipbuilders of Norway. Axes and saws, whacking and grinding as nature looks on. Warmer sun and winds usher not only the season of spring, but also the season of Viking excursion and raiding for conquest. Sven, who just saw his 16th winter, helped his father select the right trees for making longboats to cross the North Sea from Norway to the northeast coast of Scotland. The young man marveled at the wonder of springtime, the reawakening of his homeland from its wintertime slumber. Sven and his father, two tall and sturdy men with long blonde hair, weaved their way through the mixed woods some distance from their home, silent as they examined each oak or elm tree for the proper size and characteristics. Sven would be leaving soon, and if all went according to plan, he would never return to his homeland. Sven was recruited into leaving on a mission to invade Scotland to the west and establish a new permanent Viking territory. Sven contemplated the training and mental conditioning he had undergone in the hard winter months. He had his heart set on being with his father, taking his place as a master shipbuilder, keeping the family home in line with pride and excellence. Sven stared at the damp, cold, leaf-covered forest floor as he walked, and then up at the sun piercing through the trees and clouds. He watched his father purposefully roam the woods. No, this is not for me, Sven thought. I'll never do this again. I have more important things to accomplish for my people. A sense of upwelling pride and purpose in his new, improved future beat upon the remaining guilt and dismay he felt about leaving. He remembered the pain of having his father betray him and hand him over to be a seafaring conqueror last fall. I was such a baby, Sven mused. I've always wanted to be a Viking warrior anyhow, and I will be the best. Everyone will hear the tales of my success and will sing songs about my strength in winning the new land. Sven imagined where he will be going. Scotland. He knew so little about it, and yet could still envision a hamlet. No, a city named after him. Svenland. Yes, that is what I was born to do. He smiled as he jogged over to where his father was sizing up a tree to be marked for felling. There was so much to be done. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough. It was about the end of spring when they departed. The wind and waves conspired against them, but the third morning revealed a foggy beach to the port side. Sails were lowered and oars were thrust into the sea as less than a score of longboats rode the waves to the beachhead. Camp was made and Sven looked out on the new panorama. He thought his father might have liked to experience this with him, ready to take on the world together. This new country, Scotland, was windswept and much less forested than home, at least near the coast, where he was. They were near an inlet. He thought he saw smoke in the distance toward that direction. He was curious, but he must stay with his crew for now. They will conquer the new land soon. Nightfall came and a party set out to spy the land under the cover of darkness. Then watched as a small band of Vikings disappeared into the wind-filled blackness. Sven wrapped himself in his woolen blanket, but simply could not sleep. Would tomorrow be the day that he became a Viking conqueror? Uncertainty corroded his enthusiasm and confidence. Would he know how to kill quickly as he was trained to do? Could he defend himself? Would he be able to kill a child or a girl if he had to? Could he beat and rape a woman? Sven was without any real sense of how he would be able to do all of that. In the back of his mind, he wished he would not have to do any of it. In the front of his mind, he knew he must be merciless or suffer the consequences. The morning brought encouraging news. The smoke they saw the previous day was from a village about 2 miles away with some outer homesteads, farms, and roads leading further inland and along the inlet. They had a cold breakfast, and plans of the surprise attack were being discussed. Sven was part of a small contingent that would raid the outer homesteads while the main army would pass into the village. With more than 400 armed men, they anticipated meeting minimal initial resistance. A support crew with some elite warriors was left behind to defend the camp. Sven was a talented archer and was one of the few that carried bow and arrows. He checked and counted his arrows and wished for good aim. Sven did kill that day. Men defending their homes, men coming from across the plain, women and boys and girls with farm implements running towards him in a futile effort to stave off the attack. With arrows and sword, he took life with surprising ease and determination, but Sven was not prepared for the sights and sound that surrounded him as he took so many lives and defended his own. The screams and blood rattled his senses. There were many locals in the village and outlands that did escape, and that meant the push was on to expand their mission. A team of raiders went back to the beachhead to return to the homeland in one one ship and then guide the next wave of warriors to that area. Sven and the other new Viking soldiers were assigned to imprison the survivors with ropes, holding pens, and guard. Homes were taken, and much of the supplies at the beach camp were now carried by the new Scottish slaves to the village and huts in the outlands. For now, the local people were separated into small groups and kept like cattle. Sven noticed some older men taking women with them to huts or raping them publicly. It was not sex as he imagined it, but it aroused a desire in him, vulgar, yet necessary and immediate somehow. He acted the next chance he could. He saw a young lady, a girl almost, in a group of people huddled in the corner of a barnyard. He saw that she was pretty enough, but dirty and bedraggled. He summoned his courage and waded into the group, grabbing her by the hair as he had seen the other warriors do. He led her away with sword drawn to fend off any that might challenge his violent abduction. She was beaten, pushed, and shoved into the nearest hut. Sobbing, she collapsed to the floor. Sven lost his virginity and what was left of his morality in only a few minutes. Afterwards, Sven was filled with a strange sense of ownership over this young lady. Sven noticed the hut had a partially collapsed roof. He pulled the girl up from the floor, tied a rope around her neck, and they left the damaged hut in search of a better one. The Vikings cheered and jeered as young Sven led his new bride into a hut in better condition, a short way from the main road that led to the middle of the village in the distance. Inside were two people. One of them lay dead on the floor with an arrow in their back. Ben remembered shooting him. The other was an older female sitting with her back against the center post and holding a cloth to her bleeding head. The young girl fainted as she opened her eyes and saw the victims. Sven dragged her over to the center post next to the woman and tied her to it. By the amount of blood coming from the woman's head wound, he was sure she was not a threat and might die soon. He dragged the dead man out of the hut and threw his body onto a cart with other bodies in it, some distance from the hut. When Sven returned, he could see the girl crying and staring at the woman leaning against the post and speaking to her. The woman had dropped her hand and the cloth away from her head. Sven could see she was bleeding badly, but the wound had not penetrated her skull. Sven began to think it might be a good idea to have both of these women for himself. He ignored them as he looked around the hut. It was fairly large actually, with a fire pit at one end, some older but serviceable furniture. He found a bucket and filled it in a small pond made from a dam stream near some of the outer huts. He brought the bucket back and set it before the younger woman and untied her. She immediately got up and put some of the water in an iron pot and started a fire. Sven spoke to her with harsh, demanding words that he knew she could not understand. It seemed to Sven that the girl apparently knew the hut well as she gathered materials to treat the woman's head. Attacks on the Vikings from the Scottish that had previously escaped were keeping the Vikings on edge, so it was important to scour the area for any remaining Scottish rebels. Sven left the hut to help search for escapees. With his comrades patrolling in the area, escape by the two women was virtually impossible. Sven would not come back from the work at hand for days. Left alone, the two in the hut faced harassment and abuse almost every move they made until he returned. Future forms and functions. June of 811 AD brought a series of unseasonably cold storms to northeast Scotland. Flowers, grasses, and shrubs were battered. Animals hunkered down in the damp heathers and shadows of small trees. After the initial invasion activity, Sven had become more routinized and domestic. He built a large extension to the hut and made it into a lodge of sorts that even had a few rooms formed by partitions, which also helped support the structure. Nars, cargo ships from his homeland, arrived with some regularity, as well as ships carrying people willing or required to migrate to the new Norse land. Logs, lumber, and domestic animals began to arrive, and were slowly dispersed according to need and status. Regional patrols became more necessary as bands of Scottish men and boys continued to raid and assault the Viking settlements. Eventually, victory was more or less won, and any remaining Scottish rovers departed for safer lands. Sven had just finished thatching the roof of his lodge when storms started hitting the coastal regions in June. Sven had learned some of the Scottish language, and his captives learned some Norse. The women in his hut turned out to be mother and daughter, and Sven learned that the dead man they saw in the lodge was the girl's father. Sven had apparently taken the girl back to her very own home to imprison her. The older woman's head wound had healed to some extent, although her hair had not grown back completely. Blow had caused a concussion and she suffered spells of disorientation. Sven treated both women as servants with very little compassion. The girl's name was Catriona, and her mother's name was Brega. They were beaten and subjugated into doing all of the domestic work, as well as anything Sven commanded them to do, which included regular sexual encounters. The women talked warily about escape and plotted revenge against Sven and the Vikings. They also lamented their lack of health and ability. The cold, rainy June meant more time inside the lodge, and it was oppressive and bleak. One day, Sven's mother arrived in a longboat. Sven's father, Bersi, had died the month before of a persistent high fever. Sven was grief-stricken and welcomed his mother to the lodge with Catriona and Brega. Her name was Hrefna, for her hair was as black as a raven. Sven's mother quickly became his compatriot in the oppression of the two Scottish women, and his enforcing proxy when he was absent on Viking business or hunting. Scoldings and beatings were part of the daily routine, and the Scottish women wished for revenge on their Viking overlord. Summer wore on and the conditions improved in the land. Some of the battle-scarred landscape had recovered. Farming and animal husbandry were being established. For the Viking slaves, fear and hatred were slowly converting into resignation and mere survival. A disabled elderly Scotsman was taken in by Sven. He was described by Brega as her older brother. He had suffered a spear wound to his leg, and his arm was broken by a club during the initial invasion attack. His name was Briak, for he was blessed with many freckles. Briak helped around the lodge and his community as best he could, despite his permanent disabilities, and he was a well-regarded member of Sven's household, but not treated with civility by the Vikings. In early October, it was made known that Catriona was probably pregnant. Sven now believed that he was firmly established as a Viking conqueror and imagined his family line extending into eternity. Sven's mother, Hrefna, cautioned Sven about the birth of their child, warning about the rebellious nature of the Scottish people and that devotion to the Norse would be difficult to foster and depend on. Sven considered the matter and went about his business of preparing the community in his lodge for the looming winter months. Winter, his first winter away from home, would be different. Everything was different here. It did snow, and the ocean brought cold rain and sleet as well. Finding food, storing food, and gathering fuel was an all-day job starting in the fall until late spring. The winter that year was brutal, but the preparations and hard work saw most of the inhabitants through it, with only a dozen or so succumbing to illness or exposure. Spring arrived none too soon. The warm sun and mild winds brought much relief, flowers, and in May the baby arrived, a girl. Sven was disappointed that he had not been given a son. His mother suggested that he kill the baby and find another wife, preferably Norse. Sven wondered at the beauty of the child and stowed his bitterness by renaming her Embla, which signified the elm tree and the Norse symbol for the first woman. Sven felt this connected his daughter to divine appointment for the continuation of his line in the new land. Embla was a bright spot in the lodge, and everyone save Sven and Hrefna, who detested the Scottish and their land. But Sven found himself increasingly fond and protective of his daughter. Once while Catriona was nursing Embla, Hrefna made a disparaging comment to Catriona and threw a dirty sock at them. Sven got up, furious with his mother. He commanded her to never ever disrespect or harm his daughter in any way, or it would be Hrefna herself that would suffer dearly. Hrefna was visibly amazed and shaken that her son would take sides with the lowly Scottish, but knew he was serious and minded the threat dearly. Embla became remarkable in her growth and behavior. She amazed everyone with her awareness and good health. It was common in those times that infants would not live for very long, or that they would have persistent health issues. Disease, malnutrition, the elements, and even being killed or abandoned to die was not unheard of, but not Embla. She was indeed a strong young elm and became a source of pride for Sven and his lodge. Through her entire childhood, Embla never got sick. She never had any real physical complaints. Her minor cuts and bruises tended to heal quickly. She also seemed to avoid being eaten alive by midges and biting flies. Hrefna made overtures to members of the community to help her dispose of Embla and Catriona. Although she met with some understanding, she also met with disdain and estrangement. People saw something special in Embla and were wary to avoid harming someone that might have the hand of God or the gods upon them. Embla's childhood was difficult. Catriona was a good, nurturing mother, but before Embla was 6 years old, Catriona had become pregnant 3 more times. Embla had a sister who died at the age of 2 months, a brother, Andor, 2 years younger than her, and another brother, Aron, almost 5 years younger. so Catriona spent little quality time with Embla. Brega, Embla's Scottish grandmother, became Embla's closest family member. Brega had never become pregnant by Sven, and eventually he lost any sexual interest in her. Embla's great-uncle Briak was always supportive and cheerful, but he was forced to be a slave to the entire lodge, and just about any Viking in the area that Sven gave permission to use him. Embla made friends with many children in the area, and was quite affable and outgoing. Her close friends were two girls a bit older than her, Ithrig and Koira, and she even had a friend that was a boy, Triggev. Triggev was older than all of them. He came as a toddler from Norway. He was a tried and true friend to all three girls. These four stuck together and found ways to enjoy the coastal area they inhabited, fishing, working in the fields together, and sometimes playing games they made up, or just talking. Even though Triggev was a true-born Norwegian, he was accepted as one of the gang that had been born of immigrant Vikings or mixed blood lineage. This was a bit of an issue, even though it had been over 10 years since the Vikings raided and conquered the area. Viking tyranny and oppression was still very prevalent and enforced. Sometimes when the weather was nice, Briak and Brega would take Embla and her brothers off to a nice warm place in the sun to play and tell them stories about the heritage of their land and ancestors. The youngsters were instructed to keep Scottish lore close to their hearts and never share it with any Vikings or other children, as the Vikings would probably punish them. The children had seen such punishment and torture publicly displayed. Scottish ancestry, tales, or customs were strictly forbidden. Embla grew into a life of servitude, primarily to her mother, who constantly needed help with her brothers in the household, and secondarily to the community. Embla was a fair build, not too tall. She walked with an upright posture and a sense of purpose in the way she carried herself. Embla was confused and discouraged by the mean and degrading way she was treated everywhere she went. She also resented the way her younger brothers were doted upon and given preferential treatment by just about everyone, including her own mother. One fall morning, going into Embla's 11th year, she was walking with Brega. "Grandmother, why am I treated so poorly even though I work hard and try to be cheerful? Am I not half Viking?" "It is not enough that you are half Viking, Embla," Brega explained. "It is because you're a girl, a female." "Why does that matter, Grandma?" Embla asked. "It is very sad, my dear," Brega explained, "but it has always been that way. Men are generally more aggressive and larger than women, and they use that in many ways to harm females and make us feel inferior and helpless against them." As they walked, Embla thought very hard about this and put her hand in Brega's hand as they walked. "I'm going to change that, Grandma. It's wrong what they do to us." "I wish you would," chuckled Brega. "A few have tried. I know I was one. You may suffer for any attempt, but maybe, just maybe, you will indeed be that strong elm woman the world has been waiting for. Consider it well. Be patient and wise, and listen to your heart. If this is your destiny, you will know when the time is right to act." They walked slowly back home, hand in hand, with a chilly wind in their faces. They were silent, pensive, fantasizing. "This is our own secret, Grandma. Okay?" Embla whispered as they drew near the lodge. "Aye, my special lassie, it will be so." Brega winked. They looked at each other with hard, resolute faces. A fire was now burning in Embla's heart as they entered the lodge. They were greeted by a horrifying scene. Embla's brothers were sitting upon Uncle Briak, laying on the floor, beating him with a stick in their fists. Hrefna was standing near them, kicking Briak and laughing as the boys pummeled him. Brega rushed at Hrefna, tackling her to the hard floor. Embla grabbed her brothers by the hair and yanked them away from Briak. Amazed at her strength and seeing clumps of their hair in Embla's clenched fist, they wailed out in pain. Embla came at them, slapped them both fiercely, and they cowered in a corner of the room, immobilized with shock and fear. "Don't move until I say so," yelled Embla. The brothers looked at each other with tears in their eyes, and they nodded. Brega was on Hrefna and beating her senseless. "Grandma, stop, you'll kill her." Brega looked up at Embla and nodded. As she got up, she kicked Hrefna in the ribs, and Hrefna rolled over, moaning and clutching her side. They both went over to Briak and knelt beside him. He was not moving. He was breathing, but not responsive. His face was bruised, raw, and blood was coming from his mouth and nose. Embla got up as Brega tended to Briak and went over to her brothers with daggers in her eyes. "Explain yourselves, now," she commanded. Her brothers, yet little boys, burst into fearful tears when they saw the immense fierceness of their sister's demeanor. The boys, trembling, Both pointed a finger at Refna. The vengeance and hatred welling up inside Embla seemed to flood every cell in her mind. The years of abuse at Refna's hand fueled an overwhelming desire to slit her throat right then and there. Instead, she rolled Refna onto her stomach and hog-tied her hands behind her back. Embla straightened up as she stood, then found a stool and sat down, brooding. "How is Briak?" Embla asked Brega. Brega looked at Embla and shook her head grimly, her eyes damp yet strong. Embla looked at the boys. "Where's our mother?" she demanded. Andor, the older of the two, replied, "We aren't exactly sure. She said she wasn't feeling well. Father came later and took her away." Briak opened his eyes, just partially, and lifted a wizened hand toward Refna. "She poisoned your mother, Embla," he groaned. His hand fell back down and his eyes closed slowly. Embla's new panic, confusion, and helplessness regarding her beloved mother now infused her anger with a new zeal. She sat Refna up with her back against the center post, not knowing it was the same center post Brega and her mother were tied to so many years ago. Instead of tying Refna's hands behind her back, she bound her hands and tied them up above her head. She bent down a little, looked Refna in the eye, and slapped her across the face as hard as she could. "Tell me now what you have done to my mother and where my father has taken her." Refna was obviously in a lot of pain, but somehow managed to sneer at everyone, grin, and generate a mouthful of spit directed at Embla. Embla was too quick, and the spit landed weakly on the floor. "I should clean that up with your face, you old witch. You are my grandmother, but a demon you have always been." She smiled at Refna now, a smile that terrorized Refna, but Refna would not let it be. "Your grandmother by accident," she retorted. "I should have killed you and your dirty whore of a mother when I had the chance. You just wait till your father gets home." That's when Embla snapped. Embla took a wide leather strap and wrapped it across Refna's mouth. Tears streamed down Refna's cheeks as she struggled to breathe. Sven might return at any moment, so Embla had to act quickly to avenge the situation in her mind. "Boys," she yelled at her brothers, "tell me how this woman has poisoned our mother." Outside, rain began to fall, and thunder cracked as the sky darkened. The boys looked at each other and shrugged meekly. Embla stood up and started walking towards them. Then the younger brother, Aron, spoke up. "We don't really know Embla, but Grandma Refna gave Mommy a special drink, and Mommy seemed to like it. After she drank it, Uncle Briak found out about it and started to argue with Grandma. Mommy got very sick and threw up. She went to bed, and later on, Father came home and took her to the healer's house. When Mother and Father left, Grandma made us play beat-up on Uncle Briak. We were just having fun, and she said it was a playtime thing to do. What you did was wrong. But thank you for telling the truth, Aron." Embla smiled a little, gently patting his curly head. Outside, the intensity of the thunderstorm increased. Lightning and rain beat down upon the world around them. Embla turned to Andor. "Now, Andor, where's the special drink that Grandma gave Mother?" Andor pointed to a wooden vessel on the table. Not anticipating an unwinded turn of events, Refna had foolishly left her poison concoction right out in the open while she delighted in the beating of Briak. Embla made her move. She took the strap away from Refna's face, slapped her forcefully again, and then shoved a wooden spoon into Refna's mouth. She turned the spoon up to prop Refna's mouth open. Refna defiantly resisted and ground her teeth against the spoon because she knew what was about to happen. Blood trickled down Refna's chin as Embla grabbed her hair, forced her head back, and began to drizzle the poison into Refna's mouth. "Boys," Embla commanded, "come here. Watch and see what Grandma gets for making you beat a crippled old man and poisoning our mother." The boys crept forward. Brega left Briak's side and joined them. She held the boys' hands, and they watched as Embla drizzled the poison into Refna's mouth. Refna's eyes bulged, darted, and pleaded as she struggled to breathe. She gasped, then gulped, gasped, and gulped, and then began to change color. Embla drained the cup, then Refna seemed to pass out. Then Embla let Refna's head fall to her chest with a spoon still sticking out of her mouth. Refna convulsed and vomited. Then she was dead. Those present vowed to Embla that they knew and saw nothing of what happened and would never speak of it to anyone. The next morning, Sven came home. A few people were milling around the outside of his lodge, and he saw what must be a body covered in a blanket. Without a word, he pulled back the blanket and saw not only the blanched face of his dead mother, but also the swollen and bloodied face of Briok. Small coins were placed on Refna's eyes, but none on Briok's, who gazed up from partially open eyelids. Sven had seen much death, and yet found himself struggling with this and became somewhat weak in the knees. A neighbor patted him on the back as Sven entered the lodge. He stood silent as he gazed on the members of his remaining family. The boys were at the table, sitting quietly. Brega and Embla were at the kitchen area chopping potatoes. They all looked up at Sven in silence for a few moments. Then Embla asked, "Where's Mother?" Sven gave her a grim, yet almost compassionate look. He said nothing, but went and sat down next to the boys and softly rubbed their heads. Brega and Embla sobbed as what they feared was confirmed. No comfort or explanation was asked of Sven, nor was one given. In the same way, Sven accepted the death of his mother and Catriona in true Viking fashion. Honored their dead for a little while, but there was no place for much else. Refna was buried in a Norse cemetery in a plot outlined like a Viking longboat. Briok and Catriona's bodies were unceremoniously discarded in a bog near the inlet, where most of the dead Scots were tossed or buried. Casting shadows and spears. Sven entrusted Embla to run the affairs of the lodge as he became older and feeble. Winters now racked his bones, and spring brought increasing infirmity. Brega was dying. The wound she had received during the Viking invasion became a source of headaches for her. One morning she went out to tend the sheep and was found curled up in a bed of straw. Brega was buried in the bog after a brief ceremony, and Embla grieved bitterly that she had not said goodbye to her, the true champion of her life. Embla's brothers and friends were all growing up and taking on more responsibilities in their homes and the community. Many people in the area around Embla's lodge had moved away. A village had been established near the inlet, and many people had taken to fishing, growing vegetables, or some other trade to provide for themselves and the community. Sven and Embla acquired much of the land south of the village, and that included several huts and lodges. Sven, Embla, Aaron, and Andor occupied the main lodge, but the brothers would soon be out on their own. A larger lodge with an adjoining hut was ceded to Embla's friend Tryggve. Together with Sven's help, they purchased lumber and other materials to build a barn. There they began to raise sheep and cattle. Her other friends, Ithrig and Koira, came to Embla's farm to work, not as paid servants, but rather to be partners in a growing wool and dairy business. Tryggve began to grow crops and bought land adjoining Embla's with the plunder his father left him, and increased the amount of grains and potatoes he grew. Tryggve soon developed a thriving general store, brewery, and a pub in the village. Embla was something of a phenomenon in the area. She was not full-blooded Norse. She was a young female. She was not from an affluent family. Yet everything about her seemed more advanced and successful for her age and station in life. With all of those attributes, Embla was a popular figure in the area. She had many friends, but along with that, some people were jealous or resented her success. In the spring of her 15th year, quite near her birthday, Embla had a vision. She had been sitting on the top of a knoll tending sheep in the heather when she dozed off on some soft grass. Embla dreamed that she saw her mother, Catriona, lying on her back on the side of a hill, with a sword on her chest, as if being prepared to be buried with it. She was wearing dark woolen clothes of the ancient Scottish design, and was looking up at a darkening sky. A beautiful jeweled yet sturdy golden crown rolled down from the top of the hill and rested against her mother's head. A small stream appeared in the base of the hill near her mother's feet, and became ever widening as Embla gazed upon it. The crown near Catriona's head began to shine brightly. Catriona grabbed the hilt of the sword with both hands, and it too began to shine. She raised it up until it pointed perfectly upwards, and she held it there. Embla looked around and now saw bodies of countless dead men all around Catriona's body. It began to rain, and the bodies of the men began to slide down the hill and into the river where they drifted away. One man got up and walked to Embla and Catriona. He seemed familiar, but a stranger nonetheless. The rain became heavy, and he bent down as if to shield Catriona from the rain. Embla was startled in the dream when she saw that he was the only man alive, yet he had a black arrow stuck deeply in his back. He took the sword from Catriona's hand, turned and said to Embla, "I will carry the sword, but you must take the crown before it is swept into the river." Embla reached out for the crown, and it came to her hand before she even touched it. Brightness of the sword and crown faded as they stood over Catriona. Then Catriona's body became cloudy and translucent before their eyes, and she slowly disappeared. Embla was shaking with grief and anger, and she felt her jaw clenching. The man with the arrow in his back took Embla's free hand and said, "We must climb to the top of the hill and master this storm storm. Embla felt unsure, but somehow trusting him, climbed the side of the hill, sliding in mud, clambering and clawing their way. A distressing part of the dream it was to Embla, as the top of the hill seemed ever distant. Yet suddenly, there they were at the top, surrounded by lush grasses in a warm sunny day. Embla looked around in wonder. A ways off, she saw an old woman sitting on a simple wooden stool. It was her grandmother, Brega. She ran to Brega, knelt beside her, and exclaimed, "Grandma, I saw Mother, and I got this from her." She showed Brega the radiant crown. They held the crown in each other as each marveled at it. "Grandma, I met someone on the hill. I want you to meet him." Embla turned to see that the man with the arrow in his back was gone, but the sword was driven into the turf near the edge of the hill. "Go get that sword and bring it to me, Embla," Brega told her, taking the crown from Embla. Embla, confused, ran over and pulled the sword out of the ground with all of her might. She turned, held it high, and it began to shine again. She went back to Brega and presented it to her. Brega shook her head. "No, dear, these things are for you. Please take good care of them. I know the man that helped you. He is a good man. I will go find him. Please stay here, and we will see you by and by." Brega handed the crown to Embla and then got up and disappeared over the hill. As she left, Embla sat down and the stool seemed to become something of a larger chair, as if a throne with wide arms. The crown rose, and she could sense it hovering above her head. She was now clad in fair yet strong Scottish battle gear, and the sword lay across the arms of the throne. She gazed out and saw trees sprouting all over the top of the hills. They were Rowans. She loved rowan trees and got up to admire them, then awoke from her dream. "Rowans!" Embla cried aloud. A sheep nearby looked up at her and then returned to grazing. "Rowans," Embla muttered. What did it all mean? How could she have fallen asleep while tending her flock? How long has she been sleeping? With no hope of reconciling the situation by its elements, Embla just sat back, had a drink of water and sighed. It was a crazy dream, but just a dream nonetheless. None of it made any sense, yet she felt herself strangely strengthened and motivated by it. Later that evening, Embla lit a fire in the lodge and sat with Aaron and Andor, and they played a game like dice with small stones. Sven was covered under furs on a bed. Sven tried to sit up, and one of the boys went over to him. "I want to go home and die," Sven announced. He was a cold, hard man that never did anything besides hurt and plunder, until he could do no more. He worked well with his Viking comrades for a while, but they all left or died. "Boys," he said, "please set up a new grand city and name it Svenland for me. Will you do that?" The boys simply stared at him, then helped him lay back down. He requested passage on the next ship back to Norway, and he left with the next ship less than 2 weeks later. It was fall, and the sea was dark gray and choppy as the Nar sailed away to the east, taking Sven back home. A new tribe and times. Now that Sven was gone and presumed dead, Embla became lord of the estate in a sense. This prospect did not sit well with her. Sven was the male figurehead in all of the family's dealings in business and the community. Without him, she was just a young woman deserving little or no respect or consideration. She loathed the idea of going it alone, so she met with her close friends and her brothers at her lodge to discuss the way forward. Ithrig and Cora worked closely with Embla, but they both had husbands and households of their own. Triggev was married, had 2 small boys, and a supportive wife. Triggev was more involved with Embla and her brothers, as she was a generous business associate. He was a known success in the region, and he had no problem dealing with the men of the village or surrounding areas. Ithrig and Cora could offer little in the way of practical support, but since they had now started a woolen goods shop and a grain mill by the stream with the help of their husbands, they felt a prosperous business environment would justify supporting Embla publicly if need be. Her brother Andor, however, was of the mind that the entire estate should rightfully be his, even though he was younger than Embla. He went on to say that Aron and some other businessmen had already been in discussions, and they were planning to push Embla out of the driver's seat. The room was silent as Andor described the future for what Embla and her friends had built. This revelation was a nasty surprise to all in the room save for Andor and Aron. Embla glared at Andor and brushed her auburn locks from her face. Andor stared back resolute. Embla turned her gaze to Aaron, who sheepishly looked down at the floor. So, that's how you think it will be, Andor? You and Aaron have already conspired against me? Without a brain in your head. You are just going to bring in outsiders with your little brother here to take it all for yourself? My friends have no part in our state, but together we will fight you in this idea if that is what you choose. We can work together and build, or we can part ways and destroy it. You value yourself too highly, Embla, replied Andor. I am smarter than you think, and yes, I will have help. What's more, I am a man and will not fail as you eventually will. That last comment tore any love for her brothers away from her. She who had raised and nurtured them through all the years of strife. With fire in her eyes, she got up and stomped one foot on the floor. We shall see what we shall see, Embla shouted. Andor got up and demanded Embla leave the lodge at once. He was bigger than Embla, and Aaron stood beside him. Furious and heartbroken, Embla quickly gathered some belongings and left the lodge. She asked Tryggve if she could stay with his family while things got sorted out. Tryggve agreed. Ithrig and Cora helped carry some of Embla's important belongings to Tryggve's barn, and they all went into his lodge. Inside, they sat in disbelief at what had transpired. Tryggve's wife Leafy joined them at the table to take up a new discussion. Embla realized that lines had been drawn and sides chosen, and the members of her team appeared to be far outnumbered. This is all because I am a woman. We are women. Embla looked at the ladies around here. It's wrong and it has to stop. I cannot ask you to commit to anything. I am unmarried and have nothing to lose. You all have other considerations, and I respect that. This is how I see it. Let's all keep on in business as usual. I can't go home, but I can work for you now, and we will see how Andor's scheme plays out, and who are the men on his side besides Aaron. I will contrive a plan of my own. This situation will not be abided. With little more discussion, they committed to working together as a plausible solution could be conceived and implemented. So it was, with Embla living with Tryggve's family and working diligently for her friends. One facet to the plan was that anyone that came to buy something from them, or if they were to buy from someone else, they had to be in the company of a female to be part of the transaction. At first, the whole notion was balked at, and as Embla anticipated, many transactions in her surrounding area failed, or were informally embargoed. Undaunted, Embla made her way around town and in the countryside, making alliances with the women of the land and the more sensible businessmen. She made a list of people and places that were favorable, or at least a little favorable, to doing business with her in her cause of equal trading practices for both genders. She hired a couple local men and women to help her deliver goods with horses, and the small cart she purchased when Sven became too feeble to do much physical labor. She stayed up at night making notes and records in duplicate and hiding one copy. She did the same thing with maps she drew, indicating the most productive and friendly stops for her trade route. Embla was such a good business person that it was difficult for homes and village businesses to turn her down solely based on her gender. For instance, she always made sure of great quality wool or woolen products. Her goods were attractively priced, and she was willing to barter equitably. She was always smart, to the point, dependable, and courteous. The women in the entire area admired her. Even pure Viking women from Norway would praise and support her enthusiastically. Embla became aware of the men and women to stay away from, and even had a sense that she might be in some danger. Still, she continued to prosper and become stronger. Hamlets, homes, and villages were all being converted to Embla's fair trade practices, and even individual homes and lifestyles were changing when the men saw great value in treating their wives, daughters, and friends with equality and respect. It was a slow process. People can be slow to embrace new ideas, but it was beginning to pay off. Andor was indeed a miserable failure at managing the farm and livestock. He was never even good at the lesser complex duties he was used to. His business partners fleeced him worse than his sheep, and Aaron was not much better. Andor was still very bitter towards Embla. The brothers needed help. They realized too late they were unable to make a go of it themselves, and had to break relations with their farmhands and business partners for lack of resources. Aaron and Andor fought bitterly when Andor discovered Aaron had sold the sheep and cattle to Ithrig and Cora, along with a large cart and some tools that Andor had purchased with the remaining gold coins Sven had given him. Andor began to ridicule Embla behind her back in the village, and tried to marshal support from other men that were not too fond of treating women equally. He promised rewards to any that would kill Embla and Tryggve, and then steal everything from the producing farms near Andor's, including those of Ithrig and Koira. Andor had a reputation of scuttled plans and poor management, so a few of the greedier men in the area secretly decided to proceed with Andor's plan, with Aaron, but without Andor. Over bread and wine in the pub, plans were made and details discussed. Andor had a girlfriend named Hulda that worked in Triggev's pub. She overheard bits and pieces of some of the discussions around the fireside at the pub. Few times Aaron was in attendance. Hulda imagined that something like an attack on Andor in this area was in the near future, so she went out in the country to Andor's house one night when her parents were asleep. Hulda crept in and went to find the bed Andor slept in. The dirt floor was mostly quiet, but the door creaked a bit, and some sound came from the soles of her boots as she made her way inside the dark, long lodge. Startling Aaron would be a disaster. She found Andor, held her hand over his mouth, and whispered for him to come outside quietly. Once there, she led him some distance from the lodge, and they began to speak in low voices. The men in the village are making plans to attack and take over Triggev's farm and the others in the area. Aaron is included in these plans, and they have sworn allegiance against you, she told him. I do not know the details, but they look to implement this plan very soon, from what I gather. Andor could not conceal his surprise, and his anger was tearing at him like a lion's claws. Thank you, Hulda, Andor whispered. Go home quickly and quietly now, and for your own protection, speak no more of this. I will take care of it and come to the village for you when it has all been settled. So they embraced, and Hulda departed for the night. Andor went back into the lodge and found Aaron sitting up in his bed. Is everything okay? Aaron asked. Yes, I think so. I think I heard something outside, but I found nothing, Andor lied. Oh well, back to sleep then, said Aaron. But Andor could not sleep. He was angry, but also scared. Very scared. Was killing him and taking his farm a part of this new plan he was not a part of? He felt alone and helpless, so he brooded until the cock crowed in the morning. The next day at Triggev's farm, the family, farm workers, and Embla sat down to have a midday meal. Triggev grinned. Embla, you're working us to death, he laughed. Where do you get the energy? You're the first up and working and the last to stop. You are superhuman. Have mercy on us. Those at the table nodded and laughed in agreement. Why, I'm just a part of a great team, she said, bowing and putting her right hand over her heart with a coy smile. Do the bees cheer the first one to leave the hive at dawn, or curse the one that is first to return at dusk? No. We are all doing our part as we are able. It makes me happy to have so many great friends and co-workers. They all clapped and stomped their feet in agreement and laughter. The mealtime was concluding when they heard the door opening. In burst Andor with bow and arrow, and he drew it against Embla. You, he cried, you have destroyed my life. You and your notions of equality for women and insisting on other such crazy ideas. I have nothing now, and even worse is coming, so I will see your end before mine. Triggev stood up. Andor, please wait. We don't know what you're talking about. Let us discuss it. Andor raised the bow towards Triggev and let the arrow fly. Triggev turned and the arrow just missed, slicing through the top of the shoulder on his vest. As Andor reached back to grab another arrow from his quiver, they saw a hand behind him grab his arm and pull it back. Then Andor stumbled forward and fell face down on the long table, then slid to the floor. Everyone looked up and saw Aaron with a dagger in his hand. I'm sorry, Embla, Aaron told her. I'm sorry, everyone. He looked at the entire room of people, now stricken with disbelief and horror. Embla, everyone, trouble is coming, and I'm a part of it, I'm afraid. I have been fighting with Andor for some time. He knows I support you, Embla, my sister, and he made me obey him by threatening to turn you in for killing Grandma. It doesn't matter now. He is dead and won't be bothering us anymore. The truth is that Andor has been mustering men against you and your cause of equality for women. That did not include him, though. I know of more than a handful of men who are friends and farmhands fully prepared to come and attack you all, maybe very soon. They intend to take this entire area. Farms, mills, everything. I think killing Andor and taking our farm was also a part of that plan. I will gladly join with you if you will accept my tarnished past and true pledge of friendship. Embla rose. I cannot speak for everyone, but as for myself, I accept your brotherhood and friendship as if it were without blemish. I have only one question right now. How much time do we have? Hours? Days? More? Aaron put his hand on his chin and rubbed his beard, gazed down as he thought. Grimly he looked up and said, I don't know for sure. Hulda, Anders' girlfriend came in secret last night, and I heard them talking outside. I did not hear it all, but I think she was warning him that he was being excluded from the raid and booty, so he might have figured he was probably going to be killed as well. I did get the sense that it was going to be soon. They have not told me the day, but I think within a few days. That is why I followed him here. I just had a sense he wanted to seek revenge on you, for he blamed you and your success for all of his woes. I wish I could be sure of the exact plans, but that is all I know. They all turned from Aaron and looked at Embla. Nobody spoke. Embla pulled her hair back. She got her kerchief out of her apron and covered her hair with it. She walked outside and looked at the nice early summer day that everyone was a part of. She watched the birds and clouds in the intensely blue sky, then looked all around the land as far as she could see. Nothing was wrong with the picture. It was all so special and seemed perfect. This is all my fault, she thought. But am I alone in my mind or being counseled? Why am I like this? Why can't I just live and die in peace like this grass and heather? Who is making me think and do all this crazy stuff? It all seems so hopeless. Yet somehow I think it is important, but I really don't know. I only know it seems right and somehow helpful to suffer through this to my own end. So be it. Haste in the Highlands. She went back into the lodge. Anders' body had been taken up back and people were clearing the table, some silent, some talking quietly. Please have everyone, even the children, come and join us here, she requested. When everyone was assembled, she sat down next to Aaron and began to speak. I do believe what Aaron has shared with us. I know it is true and will happen soon. But now we must all decide if Aaron is really with us, or is a spy, or will betray us in any way. You have my word that you will be heard fairly if you have any misgivings about his place with us. Trigger was quick to speak. Aaron may have just saved our lives, Embla. He could have betrayed us already. Put his hand palm down in the middle of the table and said, if we are all in, then let it be true and to whatever end. You can leave or put your hand in now. One by one, they all placed hand upon hand, until at last Embla got up and put both of her hands on top of the stack of hands. I think I have a plan, she said. Her eyes were bright, her face was relaxed, and she exuded a sense of pride and purpose that were a great comfort to this house on the very cusp of destruction. That day brought packing and preparation for leaving. Despite being exhausted mentally and physically at the day's end, they still invited Ithrig and Cora's entire households over to eat and drink as if to celebrate. It was a fun surprise to have an impromptu gathering midweek and all. But as they left, Embla brought Ithrig and Cora close to her and looked them squarely in the face. Come back tomorrow morning, just after morning chores. Something is afoot that means big trouble for us all. I don't want to scare you, but you must believe me, so come. Come with everyone you know and trust. The next day, after breakfast and chores, all of the people in the small area around Trigger's farm met inside of his barn. Some stood, some sat. The sunlight illuminated the dusty air in the barn, making it glimmer as it wafted around everyone. Embla sat on a milking stool. She broke the news of the impending invasion and attempted acquisition by force of everything they worked hard for, including their own lives. The sad fact of the matter was that they were outnumbered. The town would not be able to come to their defense in enough numbers in a short period of time. Even if they could prevail against this onslaught, they did not know how much support against them might be coming from Norway. Embla knew her ideals and ways of doing business would not be accepted, but rather would garner severe punishment and probably death at the hand of the Vikings when they came. They had to act now, swiftly and decisively as possible. That meant striking first. Aaron made a list of the names and locations of all known members and some of the henchmen of the group planning to attack them. Today they would all prepare to leave, taking what they would need for an extended journey away from there. The next night they would sneak into town way after dark and take these men captive and hold them in the livery stable corral in the center of town. After each man was removed from their homes, a small group of Embla's army would enter with torches, search the men's homes, and take any weapons and horses they had stabled. The collected weapons would be taken to a wagon waiting near the road just out of town, ready to make a hasty retreat back to Trigger's farm. Once the men that were planning to attack Trigger and Embla were assembled, the village would probably be in an uproar. Embla would then expose the plot to everyone present, then leave town quickly. If all went well, no one would be hurt, and the most affected men would be without arms and horses temporarily. Once back at Trigger's place, everyone should be ready to leave immediately with sturdy soldiers, men and women on point and bolstering the rear, Embla said. I have hopes that we will find enough food and water along the way for our small troop. But we need those weapons, so please get all that you can while you are looting from these scoundrels' homes. There will be issues implementing this plan. I'm not sure if there are any Viking warriors stationed in the village now, but don't be afraid. Just be quick and forceful. The next evening, all was in the ready. 10 bands of 5 well-armed people each were assigned to roust and take the weapons from those plotting against Embla and her friends. 2 of each group, or maybe more, would bind the men and bring them to the corral at the center of town, while the others would collect weapons. They all agreed if there was a forceful resistance, that they must kill anyone impeding their mission in order to succeed and survive. If they had no other advantage, they could have speed and efficiency. Each group had a map indicating the location of the men in question. 10 homes with an unknown number of men in each. Bringing them into the center of town was a wild variable. Some men lived further out than others. Some were very violent. It was a dangerous undertaking that would be an upheaval to the community no matter what. One more group of 10 of Embla's soldiers was assigned to preparing and securing the corral for the holding of the villains, Embla's enemies. They set out just before the middle of the night, some in line, some abreast with a wagon for the collected weapons bringing up the rear. Once near the village, the wagon was drawn safely off the road. The torches were lit and the group split up. Embla watched as each torch wound its way and disappeared down the well-known paths of this hamlet she had grown to be a part of and somehow even love, if that were possible. Embla was with a group dedicated to securing the men in the corral. She and her 9 comrades made their way down the road through town with lit and spare torches enough to last. Aaron was beside her, as was Trigger, with the bow and arrows used by Andor in his failed attempt at taking Embla's life. Each person held a torch. Each person had a weapon. They went to the corral and found no horses being kept there. They searched the stable, found some horses, but decided not to take them as they were not sure of ownership. They stood guard at the corral. Soon the first group came back with a man hog-tied across the back of a horse and 2 others tied and trotting behind them. Embla's soldiers held dirk and spear to them as they entered the corral and were secured. One by one, the teams came back, along with them a growing number of villagers, some with weapons and torches of their own. 2 teams came back with only 1 horse each, but no men, which meant that the men had been killed. They presented the horses to Embla, but she bade them to leave, and they went to join the others outside the village. When they were all assembled, Embla's soldiers held a sword and a torch, surrounded the corral and faced the villagers. "You all know me," she cried, "and you all know these men, your neighbors, because I am a woman with a jealous and angry brother Andor, who was betrayed by these men who have conspired to attack me, my brother Andor and his farm, Triggev and his farm, Ithrig and Korev's farm, and take all of what we have for themselves." The crowd began to talk loudly all at once. "Like I said, you know me, and you also know the character of these men, so you know I am telling the truth. These men are villains and scoundrels. It would be an easy thing for us to kill them and battle with everyone here. Save for our lives, we have nothing to lose. Our lives are bound to our honor, which we will never betray, even at that final cost. But no, we turn them over to you to decide their fate." The crowd became silent. "We leave you now and ask that you suffer a safe passage from you in this village that we have grown so fond of. More Vikings may be coming, so our time is at hand to leave you as well we may. It is with heavy hearts, but much gratitude, that we leave you with all of our best wishes." The crowd around them was awestruck, and some wept. Some came forward to examine the men held captive, and some began to try to reconcile the situation with Embla. The scene started to become chaotic. Arn shouted and started towards the stable barn. Men with torches and swords were running towards the corral from inside the stable. Men obviously mustered to quash this uprising. Arn engaged the men single-handedly and prevailed until some villagers joined the fray and saved Arn from certain death. 2 of the rogue attackers retreated. One fell and his torch flew into one stall where the straw ignited instantly. The villagers all ran in and began to fight the fire with foot and shovel. Embla shouted to her team and they all fled on horseback with extra horses beside. As they neared the rendezvous spot, they saw many torches, more than should be, some along the roadway making way. "Fly!" she cried. As they drew near where the wagon was, they saw gathering of people along with her team. When Embla arrived, they extinguished their torches, and the few stragglers along the road came soon to join them. Embla rose up on her horse and surveyed the crowd with wonder and anguish. They were not fighting, so why were they there? Korra stepped out and said, "They have left everything to come and join us because they believe in you and fear the aftermath of the event events this evening. Embla looked them over, 2 score at least, from the greatest to the least, from the youngest to the oldest. Some with nothing, some with bags of belongings, some with a cart and horse, some sharing with someone else, some even pure Norse like Tryggve. Embla summoned a courageous spirit. She spoke softly. Friends, what a welcome surprise you are. You joined us to an uncertain destiny. The time to go back home is now, for here is the point of no return. From now on, we work and live together. For better or worse, we will arrive at a place we will call our own. There is no place for slackers, gossips, or grumblers. I can promise you that. I can also promise you our friendship. Choose now, for we are in great haste. As if with one mind, they all left at once, heading down the road back to Tryggve's farm as quickly as the horses and carts could go. When they arrived at Tryggve's farm, it was probably past midnight, and a misty fog rolled over the land. A light wind made everything cold and damp. Tryggve brought his horse alongside Embla's. So, what next, he asked. Neither had anticipated the additional people from the village. I was going to ask you the same thing. She grinned at him as the mist dropped from the sides of her hat onto her face. Torches were lit, and Embla addressed the assembly from horseback. We are leaving this area right now. We have a guide, a shepherd who knows an old road leading up and away from the coast. We are heading to the highlands. It will be a long journey, probably days. There were no Viking ships on the beach or anchored nearby. It could be weeks before a ship comes, or it could be days. One woman raised her hand. The last ship left 2 weeks ago, with no word of a returning ship anytime soon. Embla thanked her and continued, That is good news. So we are not in haste, but we must keep going, and we must care for each other. Some of the folks in the village will be upset. People have died this night. And look back now. Part of the village is on fire. This is not our doing, but we could certainly be unfairly blamed. The villagers will come this way, looking for us maybe, but more likely to loot and lay claim to what we have left here. The Vikings are going to come. Any villagers angry with us will wait for them and put it to them to hunt us down, which they will likely do. Like ourselves, they are in no hurry, but we'll keep going. Embla looked at the group gathered around her. Now let us go with cheerful hearts and hopeful for what the days ahead will bring. The shepherd that was to lead them and her family brought torches and bid the assembly to follow them. On and on through the rest of the night they went, up and up, trudging ever slowly away from the coast. Just as dawn was breaking, Embla looked back and saw the glimmering rolling sea, the clearing fog, and a thin line of smoke rising from the village area. Just being alive and away from that place of dark memories made her feel glad for this new time. She looked ahead now. Around her she saw people that she guessed might feel the same way. The way forward was a much different story in Embla's mind. She was wrapped with awe and wonder. She saw hints of a forest poking up above the horizon as she squinted west into the far distance. At the nearest spot that was level and smooth enough to accommodate the entire group, they rested. After they had refreshed themselves, Embla spoke. Please, everyone, gather around. It was cold and damp, but they stood or sat as they saw fit. Embla was touched by the smiles and love she saw in the faces of this group of pioneers. We are heading west. She pointed to where she saw the treetops. You can see this ancient path heading that way. I am betting it will not lead us smoothly or completely to our destination. We must be prepared for at least a 4-day trip, and we can all see ravines, streams, and steep hills. In short, it will not be easy, but my heart tells me true that it will be worth it. We must counsel now as to how to prepare for this journey. So the entire group discussed the ways they would address the various needs, challenges, and solutions required to make the trip as joyful as possible. Each member of the assembly was able to choose a responsibility they would commit to. Some would hunt and gather food, some would tend to the horses and a few of the sheep and cattle that came along. Some would care for the health and well-being of the whole group. That included just saying hi and listening to any ideas or comments folks might have to share. Some people would cook and clean. Some would repair and maintain anything that required it. After the council was ended, they began to inventory the supplies that they had taken with them. Of particular interest was the wagon with the weapons taken from the men in the village. Embla peered over the side of the wagon. She was delighted with the amount and variety of the booty. Among the weapons, she could see swords, knives, axes, and even saws, shovels, and hammers. Near the bottom of the pile in the wagon, Embla spotted what seemed to be the part of a pommel of a sword. It was gleaming and it showed its way into Embla's heart. She got up into the cart. Slowly and carefully she began to lift the other tools and weapons off the pile and set them aside. one by one, until at last she could see the full hilt and top of the sheath of the sword. Others gathered around the cart and began to help her. When she could see almost all of the sheath and sword, she carefully drew it out. Her mind was ablaze as she beheld it. It was a sword she had seen in the dream, the one that Catriona and Brega gave her in that dream. She racked her mind to recall the details now, bitterly cursing her dismissal of the dream, yet she smiled as she gazed upon the weapon. This was no ordinary sword. It was finely made and seemed unused. The sheath was of heavy leather with strong steelwork at the top and bottom. Fine details were worked into the leather, including an inscription of sorts she could not read. There at the top of the sheath, the steel opening that covered the leather had a fine rowan tree engraved in it. Embla's eyes welled with tears as she drew the sword from the sheath and beheld a bright, shining double-edged blade with elaborate hilt, handle, and pommel. Rowan trees were engraved on one side of the hilt and pommel, and what looked like a cross was engraved on either side of the leather-bound handle. Embla took off her belt and used it to lash the sword to her side. It seemed light and well-balanced in her hand. Her mind was a fog of confusion mixed with delight. She peered at it on her side, and with one smooth motion she drew it aloft. She was startled as she became aware of everyone now staring at her. "I have seen this sword in a vision," she cried to all the gathering. "Although I do not know the exact meaning, I accept this sword as my own during my lifetime to be a symbol in defense of all we have endured, all we will work for and build, and all we hold dear, forever. To the Rowans," she cried, and the crowd around her cheered. After a last few preparations, they began the trek anew. Stream crossings washed out areas of the road. Rain and broken carts and wagons made their going tough, but on they went, undaunted. Every evening, some folks would discuss the challenges and blessings they had encountered during the day. Not everyone participated, but everyone listened and also came to value the voice and individuality of those that did share. A fun part of the gathering was the planning of the village that they intended to establish. They would be at least 50 miles from the sea, so they decided to settle near lakes and streams. Some folks liked being close. Some folks valued some privacy. Considerations were made for the defense of the settlement from attack by Vikings or others. The plans for community building and development were discussed with the most excitement of all, and many offered their vision or added their detail to someone else's. Mock-ups were made in the sand using rocks and sticks to everyone's delight and fascination. By the end of the third day, they arrived at a point where they were able to look down rather than just up. They could now reach out and touch the trees that they had seen from afar less than a week ago. The land was indeed beautiful, more beautiful than they had ever imagined. All hearts were beating with wonder and anticipation. They found a nice spot to camp and prepared for the last part of the trip, which was finding that location to permanently settle. The next day, 2 teams of men and women set out in different directions to scout potential locations for their new settlement. The groups went only in westerly directions, not north, south, or east. They would come back in one day, and then a final expedition would go to confirm the choice made based on a preliminary vote. To everyone's surprise, both teams came back at the very same time, about noon the day after they left. Trigger's wife, Leafy, who was leader of one of the expeditionary groups, said, "We went in different directions, but found each other quite near the same spot. We don't need another foray to decide further." Emma looked at Aaron, who was the leader of the other group, and he nodded his head, smiling at her. Then at Leafy. Embla's mind was burning with questions, but she would not give in to this game of secrecy that Leafy, Aaron, and the other members of the expeditionary teams were playing. She shrugged her shoulders, smiling. "Okay, that's great. Thank you, team members. We are ready, and we'll leave in 1 hour." Aaron, Leafy, and the other team members laughed, got down from their horses, and patted each other on the back. The suspense of where they were going was on everyone's mind, but was tempered by the arduous nature of trekking across country. The path to the highlands they had depended upon was now overgrown and not visible. They followed the expeditionary team members slowly over the enchanting land around them. Woods, trees like they had never seen, hills, birds, flowers, all of it seemed so wonderfully new. By and by, they saw the edge of a long lake surrounded by grassy slopes. Instead of going to that, they turned right and went around the lake, then headed south. About halfway down the lake, they saw an immense meadow with a tree near the middle. Everyone in the group stopped alongside the team members and beheld the sight. Leafy looked at Embla and said, "This is our new home," as she spread her arm out towards the meadow, dropping her hand to point at a tree in the middle. Embla whispered, "It's a rowan." The group all shouted and cheered and congratulated each other. New lands and beginnings. At first, the group camped around the middle of the meadow, with sentinels taking shifts during the night. Nearly a month after arriving, maps of sorts were made which reflected the best of the plans discussed. The rowan tree in the middle of the meadow would be the center of town, and they named the town Rowan. The areas closest to the lake and streams would be portioned out to the people most desiring to be near them, with generous allowances for public access and gathering areas. Many people chose areas that had rowan trees near them. Areas further from town were deeded to farmers of various sorts. The village was laid out with considerations for future growth, including streets to access the village and roadways, and a plat map for housing. Wells were dug, and construction on houses and barns had begun. Foundations and plans for mills and mill ponds were made further from town. It would be a while before they received the materials and manpower needed for completion. One morning, a group of men on horseback came out of the woods from the south. The men were armed, yet did not look antagonistic. The alarm went out over the area. People dropped what they were doing and gathered around the strangers, and they proceeded to the center of the village. A group of armed villagers met them and blocked their way. The strangers seemed hesitant to dismount. Embla was watching from her friend's doorway as she strapped her sword on. "Welcome to the village of Rowan," she exclaimed. The men on horseback numbered less than 10, but they were large men and obviously had some military decorum. They looked around at the fledgling village with astonishment. One of the men, who was stocky, had long fire-red hair, and seemed a bit taller than the others, bowed to her and replied, "My lady, thank you for your courteous welcome. We come from south of here and are scouts. My name is Fergus, and these are my companions." "My name is Embla," Embla replied. "We are new to this land, and it is our hope that you come in peace. We are refugees from an area overrun by the Vikings many miles to the east of here, and we have settled in this location after a vigilant determination that this land was not previously claimed." Fergus took his sword off and bound it to his saddle. "We do come in peace. May I dismount?" Embla nodded. "If your companions share your intentions, they may do the same." Fergus and his men all stowed their swords, knives, and archery equipment on their horses, then dismounted. "We will stable your steeds during your visit. They will be well tended." Young men and women came forward and received the reins of the horses and led them off to be cared for. Fergus and his men seemed to feel welcomed, and they relaxed a bit despite being unarmed. "Please sit and take refreshment." Embla pointed to a set of long outdoor tables a short ways off. Many of the villagers returned to their previous activities, leaving Embla to visit with the strangers along with a contingent of villagers that were able to spare the time for serving and visiting with the men from the south. All of the villagers remained armed, and Fergus and his men were obviously impressed with the efficient and joyful harmony in the village. "Are you all Scottish?" Fergus asked as he sat down, looking at Aron and Triggev. "We are a mixed lot," answered Aron, "but none of us are loyal to the Norse Vikings or any Norse officials." His face was stern. "The name of this village is Rowan, and Rowan is a part of Scotland. Whether Scotland will accept her or not remains to be seen, but we will do our part to encourage Scotland's love and devotion to us despite our heritage." "I see," said Fergus. His men all looked at each other and then at the villagers. Some food and drink was being brought to the table, and some tension seemed to come over the villagers. "Well," Fergus continued, "we are in fair company then, but we are purebred Scots, with no love for the Vikings, or a new variety of Viking pioneers. It's true that we are currently unarmed and at your leave, but if we do not return, more of us, which is more than you, will come looking for us. Despite your wonderful manners, we must know now of your true allegiance." Triggev rose and addressed the visitors. "My name is Triggev. I am pure blood Norse, Viking as you say. I am true to this village and our future here. We come as independent people in the land of Scotland. We will not dishonor this land by setting up a hamlet for the Vikings. The Vikings are our enemies, as are some in the area we fled from. We would be your best neighbors and allies if you would but accept our word and try us by deed." Triggev sat down, with those present nodding in agreement. "Fairly spoken, and may it be fairly so," Fergus replied. "But you, lady," he said, looking at Embla, "do you attach yourself to this pledge? I notice your sword is different than those of your fellow transplants. Are you of some different breed than them?" Embla looked down at her sword and then at Fergus. "The sword is certainly different and special, but I am not. I know of no significance imparted by its maker. I came upon it by unofficial means, if you will." Fergus smiled and looked at his man. Fergus then went on to explain that they were also refugees of sorts. They were the next generation of Scotsmen that fled the Vikings during the initial invasion. They were all true, full-blooded Scots. Fergus and his men were rangers, scouts that regularly roamed the land looking for Vikings that might be moving inland towards their new home of peace and refuge. They came from a land with a few villages, 2 days' ride from Rowan. Fergus had followed the smell of smoke, and after they discovered the village of Rowan, they spent a few days observing it. They decided to enter the village after observing how generally non-Viking everyone was, and most importantly that no Norse banners were being flown. Fergus went on to tell them that they were returning from a scouting trip to the east and that they had indeed sighted a small army of Vikings coming up from the eastern lowlands. The group was maybe 50 men in Viking war regalia and a score of men in more rustic, less shielded garb. All were armed. They were concerned about an established Viking presence when they detoured to spy out Rowan. "We are in great haste now to return to our land, to raise alarm and muster our defenses. Now that we have met you, can we depend on you to fully defend this land against the Vikings?" Fergus asked. "They will be in the Highlands proper in 2 days for sure." The tables were silent as they all considered this news. Embla spoke. "Please suffer us a few minutes to discuss this matter, and please also continue to eat, drink, and make yourselves at home here while we are gone." Almost all the villagers at the table got up and withdrew to a larger lodge near their gathering tables. When they returned, it was only Embla, Leafy, Aaron, and a handful of other villagers. The rest departed, satisfied with the meeting. "We will engage the Vikings and their throng," Embla began. "If you are in haste, then go to your village now and meet us in 2 days at the east side of the south end of the lake. Leave now and return with all speed. In less than 2 days, if possible. We will bring 100 of our finest soldiers, and since you claim more people than we, please bring even more than that if you can. I repeat, with all haste. We are not going to wait for the Vikings to come to us. We will strike first and fiercely. We will meet you and follow you to where you think the Vikings will reach our area. But I think I know where that will be." Despite the brief nature of this first encounter, a great trust was established, and the Scotsmen departed with their pledge to alliance and victory when they returned in 2 days. 2 days later found the warriors of Rowan waiting for the Scotsmen to arrive. The wait was not long, and they were joined by at least 200 with Fergus leading the band. The Scots looked around and noticed about half of the warriors from Rowan were female. This made them uneasy, and a few of them circled their horses around Fergus and his horse before they reached the army of Rowan. "What are the ladies doing here? Is this a joke?" they asked Fergus with angry, concerned faces. "It's a small village for now," Fergus explained. "They have kept their pledge, and we shall see if they take advantage of our strength, equal it, or better it." It was too late to argue, and with high hopes and just a few fears, Fergus raised his arm and heralded the Rowans to follow him. With all on horseback, they made great speed through woods and forest, over hill and plain, to a place where Fergus raised his hand, signaling a halt as the sun began to set. There was a great meeting and mingling that evening. Some of the Scotsmen were shocked to find that Embla and the ladies of Rowan were not mere servants, and that manners equal to all were expected. There were some uncomfortable moments while this adjustment to the Scottish mindset was integrated into Fergus's men. Fergus did seem a bit concerned. "You can depend on all of our fighters to fight with excellence, Fergus," Tryggve told him, noticing his discussions with his men. Fergus looked at the dignified strength of the Rowan warriors and replied, "We all must learn new ways for our future to be successful. This is one of those times, to be sure," and he smiled at Tryggve, who nodded. Luck was with the combined army the next morning. When they neared the area where the path had first reached the Highlands no Vikings were seen. Scouts were sent ahead and returned with the news that the Viking army was getting closer, and they had little time. As passionate as the Rowan fighters were, they were not really battle-tested, so they agreed to be assigned to small groups of Scots, placed at strategic locations surrounding the areas where attacking the Vikings would be most effective. Embla requested that she be included in the outer perimeter group that Fergus positioned to attack head-on. Fergus, Tryggve, and a few others set up in a semicircular perimeter around where they anticipated attacking the Viking marauders. Rain, fog, and a chill wind followed the Vikings closely as they came over the crest of the last hill. Then they made a catastrophic error. Instead of scouting the area, the Vikings started to set up camp, possibly because of the impending foul weather and the lack of initial signs of life. The Scots and the Rowans drew their swords and crept closer despite the lack of sufficient concealment from landscape and foliage. As the perimeter groups closed in, The outer group started to slowly stand up. Embla cleared the rain and hair from her eyes, and she looked north to Fergus, who gave her the signal to charge. Embla raised her hand and dropped it as she began to run at the Vikings. Unprepared and off guard, the Vikings suffered greatly at the hands of Embla and the frontal attack squad. The Vikings and others with them were surrounded and subdued or dispatched by the perimeter soldiers as they attempted to take cover or retreat. The Vikings were not unarmed, so they did exact a toll on the defending army. 5 from the Rowan contingent were killed and 2 were badly wounded. At the end of that bloody battle, the Vikings were subdued, the wounded were slain, and the few survivors were bound. An hour after the skirmish, the rain began to get heavy and colder. The bodies of the slain Viking group were piled up near the east side of the field. The Scots and the Rowans took their dead and carefully placed them in a Viking cart, then covered them with some of the Viking clothing. The injured Rowans were placed in a Viking wagon along with the Viking gear. Most of the Vikings' belongings were taken back to the village of Rowan. There were about 15 survivors from the Viking caravan. Only a few were actual Vikings. The rest were enlisted from the village into the inlet. Embla, Tryggve, Arn, and Leafy and the rest of the defense platoon returned to Rowan and stowed all of the Viking plunder in sheds and barns until it could be sorted out. The rain was coming down hard, and the captives were held in a barnyard, bound and sitting or standing in the rain under guard. Fergus and a few of his men, Embla, and some of the more involved villagers met in a small sheep barn near Tryggve's lodge to debrief. "The gods were with us today. Even the weather gave us some aid," Fergus spoke. "With your leave, we will stay for the night and divide the Viking plunder before we depart in the morning." There were nods of approval from everyone present. "We are cold, wet, and battle-weary," Arn said. "We will serve you the best feast we can provide in celebration of the victory against the Vikings and to honor our fallen. Before we leave to prepare for the feast, we must first decide what to do with the captives." The small barn was silent. "The Vikings cannot live," Fergus said. "They are a curse and will only avenge their losses and their cause. The others are from your old village. I'm not sure about them. They need to be interrogated, and any hint of a problem will be enough reason for additional executions. My men will kill the Vikings now. You can decide what to do with the villagers yourselves." Fergus and his men left the barn and gathered the Vikings to be dispatched. Embla looked at those present. "I will question the villagers that accompanied the Vikings. If there are any that do not earn our trust, we must kill them, or they may cause harm here or flee back to the coastal village and assemble another attack." Embla soon discovered that none of the captives from the village were loyal to the Vikings, and that they might be invited to stay in Rowan or go with Fergus and his men back to their village to the south. Fergus and his men discussed the value of partnering with Rowan in trade and military support. Of great interest was the development of local industry. The Rowans were set upon raising sheep for wool and making woolen goods. They also had skill in growing grains and brewing ale. Fergus wanted to understand the value of men and women working as equals and promised that this principle in trade and battle would be strictly adhered to, and his men would foster that principle when they returned home. The overreaching concept would be that the Highlands would be known and respected for their excellent products and trade practices. The Vikings had taken much of the coast of eastern and northern Scotland, but the interior areas were not yet conquered by them. Rowan and the people of the Highlands must collaborate to ensure the security of their lands. Fergus and the Rowans decreed that there must be regular councils held to discuss these matters. Fergus told the Rowans that they did some trading with other Scots to the south and west, and even with some English nobles from far to the south, but roads and communications were not well developed or even consistent. Fergus said that the English were not to be fully trusted, except to join with the Scots in driving the Vikings out. The next morning, Fergus and his men helped divide the items taken from the Vikings, including 2 smaller carts. There were 8 captives left after the Vikings were removed. 4 went with Fergus, 4 stayed in Rowan. 2 people from Rowan also left as diplomats with Fergus and his men in a gesture of good faith and as guides as to how to travel between Rowan and the area that Fergus came from. The fall came on after a summer of plenty for the Highlands. Much progress and innovation was developed, and preparations for winter had begun. Trade and traditions were shared with the area Fergus was from. The main village, Tayfoss, was situated in between some hills approximately 50 miles southwest of Rowan. Winters in the Highlands were a bit colder and brought snow to the area. Hoyer and Ethrig employed anyone to work for small wages to help them weave what little wool they had into some cloth and garments. All during the winter, the men and women of Rowan made woolen cloth and clothing on handmade looms and wooden tools, buckets, bowls, along with working on items needing repair. Trigger and his family all worked on preparing the foundations for a mill and brewery. Aaron was married in the late fall after harvest, and he worked closely with Trigger and a few others to begin brewing ale and distilling spirits. A mill pond was made during the winter that would accommodate mills on either side. The work was wet and cold most of the time, and Rowan lost a few of its citizens due to illness and exposure to the cold that winter. England, then beyond. That spring, Rowan sent messengers down to Tafos with a list of the woolen products available for sale and trade and a list of items desired by the Rowans. The messenger returned with news that emissaries from England were making their way to the Highlands to establish trade and military relations at the northern lands, as well as assess the possibility of expelling the Viking invaders. Embla made plans to meet with the English at a crossroads inn just south of Tafos, which the English had made into a headquarters to parley with the local inhabitants, leaders, and businesses in central northern Scotland. Embla and a small group from the village made their way along the road, celebrating the beauty of the spring flowers while cursing the muddy roads. They brought samples of their woolen goods and some bags of barley and wheat to present to the English. The inn at the Tafos crossroads was small, but there was a nice barn and stable, and Embla's group pitched tents outside of the barn area and waited for one of the English diplomats to approach the group to make an appointment to discuss business and the involvement of the Highlanders for incursions into the Viking-held lands. The meeting time was set for the next morning, with representatives from all over the Highlands expected to attend. The next day saw bright meeting tents set up, and a festive air was mingled with the warm sunshine and lofty clouds. Embla and the group from Rowan were scheduled to meet formally with the English diplomats inside the inn, but a nice morning breakfast was provided outside, which allowed for some introductions and the exchange of pleasantries. Embla met with Fergus outside of the breakfast area, and he cautioned her against revealing too much to the English or Scottish, and not to agree with anything or make commitments of any kind. Embla agreed, and they decided they would meet back in his village after the councils with the English were concluded. As Embla returned to her table with the other Rowans, she was approached by one of the men from their British contingent. Nicely dressed he was, with many fine clothes and an elegant outer tunic. He seemed quite striking in appearance and friendly. Embla smiled and thought, here is one I should be careful of. The man removed his small velour hat and bowed his head. I am Kendrick Addison, a member of the troop of visiting businessmen and dignitaries. Embla replied with a stoic expression, bowing her head in like fashion. I see, and it is a pleasure to meet your acquaintance, I'm sure. I am Embla of Rowan, and I am looking forward to our conversations this day. Embla, yes, I've heard of you and desired to seek you out prior to the beginning of today's councils. You are something of a local heroine. More than a few have spoken of you in the most supportive and endearing terms imaginable. I have seen you from afar this morning and am grateful for the chance to confirm up close what my eyes have seen at a distance. Embla could not conceal her blushing, but she held her comportment and inquired, so pray tell me, have you now confirmation or negation? Kendrick smiled coyly. I avoid hasty decisions as a rule, but indeed I see that you are the exception to the rule. Then pray also tell me, what exactly was confirmed in your mind? Embla inquired. I must confess, I have not the words assembled in a way that would be proper and fitting for the brief duration of our time together, Kendrick replied. However, if you would suffer me a bit of your time at day's end, I hope to do your questions some justice. Fair enough, Embla said. I cannot promise you a meeting at the end of the day. I have other people in matters that may require my attendance, but let us not abandon the idea of meeting later. Embla bowed her head again and began to turn away, but she turned back and faced Kendrick. We can see this happy gathering all around, this beautiful woods, on this beautiful day, and I can guess that the evening will bring a continuation of these wonderful conditions. But I want to be clear, myself and the people that I came with are of a singular mindset. We have come a long way, as I'm sure you have. She gestured to the inn. When we meet in there, I hope we both agree. Business is business, and if we also agree to suffer each other's cause with business-like courtesy and consideration, the results of our meeting could well match the beauty of the day. Kendrick took out a sample of the woolen cloth the Rowans had taken with them to share with the English. He gazed at it and fondled it with both hands. This is wonderful cloth, especially considering that I am told it was woven with your handmade looms. It is fair to behold, but obviously strong throughout and durable. terrible. He paused, certainly worthy of the extra effort it must have taken to produce. Embla's heart was beating a hole in her chest as her thoughts struggled to stay above the waves of strange, new emotions that seemed to be running rampant in her mind. With a brave yet pleasant face, she nodded in affirmation and said, "I thank you for the kind words regarding the efforts of our fine caretakers and artists. I think we understand each other." She turned quickly around and headed back to the table of Rowans. They were all staring at her, and her face burned with embarrassment and the desire to smile, but she refrained. Few of them asked her what the exchange with the Englishman was about, but she only revealed it was simply a pre-meeting courtesy. But they all knew she was hiding something, and they smiled at her. She looked at the table, was lost in new thoughts. She smiled back at her friends, had a drink of cool water, and then bid her townsfolk good day and went into the inn. The meeting was held in the dining room of the inn. It was smoky, dingy, and poorly lit, but the atmosphere was energetic and welcoming. There was a long table at the far end of the room, and the floor was scattered with rugs, stools, and some tables and benches, and everyone made their way to a place to sit. The English filed in from the kitchen area and took places at the long table. Kenrick took his place at the center of the table. As he sat down, he looked up and glanced at Embla. She did her best to look businesslike and unimpressed. The day went on into the early evening, and it became clear that no matters would be settled in one day. The Rowans and those from the surrounding areas befriended the English servants, and the English noblemen became enamored with the people of the area. The English already had some relations with Tafos. Now having Embla and the folks from Rowan there seemed to add a particular enthusiasm. Embla declined to meet with Kenrick after the first day, but they agreed to meet at the end of the next day. They had gotten along splendidly, despite a few rough spots in the negotiations. Following day, equitable trade deals were struck, and contracts for wool and woolen goods were drawn up, which included the very difficult transport of new, modern equipment for farming, weaving, brewing, and other equipment from England. Military plans were discussed at length, and at the end of the second day of the meetings, a great cloud cover moved over the land, along with a chill that matched the tenor of the discussions. It was agreed that the Viking rule of the land was oppressive, and Scandinavian presence had been held at bay, but might be inevitable if the Vikings were not successfully defeated and driven from all of Scotland. More Vikings were always arriving, and it was told that the islands to the north were now entirely controlled by the Vikings. The British envoys declared their support and motivation for expelling the Vikings from all of Scotland, which was in everyone's best interest. They would request troops as mercenaries and supplies to forward the effort. The people from Rowan and Tafos realized that the Scottish kingdom was of no use to them in their area, and they felt not only isolated, but surrounded by potential enemies. England to the south and Scandinavia and all the coastal areas around them. There was some hostility and mistrust between the fledgling Scottish government and the British, even as the Vikings assumed more control of Scottish lands and people. The way the unincorporated Scottish people at the meeting saw it, they were better off creating a strong alliance with England against the Vikings and risk possible conflict with the established but absent Scottish royalty. After much discussion, the Scottish people drafted a plan to present to the English. They chose Embla and Fergus to be their spokespeople. Embla and Fergus came to the front of the room and stood so they faced the English and the locals at the same time. Fergus spoke first. "We appreciate the patience and cooperation of our English ambassadors." The ambassadors nodded to him as he continued. "We realize our position here is precarious, and we wish to work with you to build a new and strong future for everyone that accepts the hand-clasp of partnership we extend. That being said, we see the Vikings as bitter enemies whose atrocities against our people and our land will never be properly reconciled. The only hand they have extended bears a sword. As for our own Scottish government, we do not feel they have care or concern for us, and may be occupied with fighting the Vikings to the west and north of us. I'm sure to England, we are a small concern compared to both the Vikings and Scotland proper. However, we are excited for the support you have shown us, and we now formally declare our intentions to prove your support worthy." Embla then began to read from the treatise they had written as a draft contract between England and the areas of the Highlands, which was now to be called the Tafos district, due to the more established and truly Scottish nature of the village. The treatise covered only two subjects: military excellence and profitable trade practices. The Tafos district had men and women who were willing to fight and oust the Vikings from the conquered lands of Scotland, but they were poorly equipped and had no real military training or structure. This part of the treatise encouraged the development of an outpost that would be built and supplied by England and also inhabited by English military personnel acting as mercenaries and not as official British troops. Groups of people would visit and co-occupy the outpost as the English trained them and developed a military hierarchy which included the local populace. Embla saw the English contingent sit back in their chairs. They looked a bit uncomfortable. She saw a concerned look in Kenrick's face, but his eyes also gave her some encouragement. Embla was quick on her feet. "We know this is an enormous investment on the part of England, and you gentlemen also risk much by even entertaining such a notion as this, much less presenting it to your most excellent king. What we are offering is a secure but not official position in our land, a position that we will stand behind and defend even against our own Scottish government. This outpost can also serve as a place to launch attacks on the Vikings and to re-establish Scottish sovereignty in Scotland. As businessmen, I hope you are indeed seeing the upside of this arrangement for your business concerns." At this, the British emissary seemed to relax and consider the matter seriously as Embla continued. "For our part, we don't have much but ourselves, so that is what we offer, ourselves, dedicated to excellence in service to our business partners and excellence in service to our military partners. Every able-bodied person, and even a few that are not so able-bodied, will be conscribed to our designs for secure and prosperous communities. To help defray the initial cost of developing a trade and military outpost, we will also offer excellent prices for our goods, as well as the ones you bring to sell us, which includes favorable trade arrangements. I'm confident that as our quality and production improve, so will your profits." Everyone in the room cheered, and the English diplomats also seemed very impressed, although not quite as boisterous. Embla thanked her supporters, waved at them, and smiling bade them to quiet down a bit. Embla looked directly at the table of the Englishmen and continued, "Now comes what may be the difficult thing for you to accept." Embla's face was soft but serious. "In Rowan, and now in the areas we currently associate with for trade and security, we have a very strict requirement. All business transactions must include both genders. That is to say, when you deliver or pick up materials from Rowan or our area of the Scottish Highlands, one or more females must be present. This is something that has benefited our communities greatly, and we insist on it continuing and expanding." The Englishmen bristled visibly, but did not seem to be over-concerned. Then Kenrick spoke. "Your words, both spoken and written, will be seriously considered. Although all of this together is a lot to think about, it has been well received. The last part, that part about insisting that women be active participants in all business concerns, will that also apply to our military plans as well?" Embla nodded, and the crowd in the inn cheered again. Kenrick chuckled and looked down, glancing at his associates, who were now very obviously concerned. "Well now, Embla, you drive a hard bargain, and almost impossible to some extent." There was some laughter and chatter in the crowd. "That being said, the English have a great interest in this area, and collaborating with such strong and dedicated people will make this much easier to present to His Majesty and also the Scottish hierarchy if we eventually entreat them. Without committing to anything, I can speak for my college to some extent here, and although this is unofficial, I am optimistic that we can forge mutually beneficial and long-term cooperation here, including your last provisions." Kenrick looked directly at Embla and gave her a little smile. "Some of us have wives or daughters or sisters of our own. It would be nice to consider them as capable as you obviously are." Kenrick concluded the council with the promise of returning as soon as possible with some formal agreements based upon the framework constructed during the last 2 days. The Englishmen prepared to leave the following morning and discuss matters among themselves. The people of the Tafos and Rowan district did likewise, but after some time they met in the village square and mingled with the others. The atmosphere that evening was cordial and enthusiastic. Everyone that had to travel the next day decided to call it a night and retire to tent or bed. Kenrick found Embla and bade her to meet privately for a few moments. The sun had set, campfires were lit, and a few groups of people remained in the square to visit a bit more, and a light, cool rain sprinkled intermittently. Kenrick and Embla took shelter in a stable barn near the inn. "This is a beautiful area, Embla," Kenrick spoke. "Despite all your people have endured, I can't help but admiring you immensely, and actually find you very lucky in a way." "We do feel lucky here," Embla replied, "and I have a growing sense there is some purpose to it all. There is something about you, Kenrick, that persuades me to drop my guard and trust you with my deepest feelings. I am gratified that you appreciate our farming and crafting abilities," she smiled. "Tryggve, brews a fine ale. The main concern to me, however, is the Vikings. They are ferocious and determined. I have a feeling they are going to push inland, probably quite soon, and it is a fair wonder that they have not done so already. I do not think an outpost here at Tafos will serve to defend this area, much less act as a headquarters to serve forays to the coast as effectively as we have imagined. I know that others I have discussed this with agree with me, but at this point we can only hope for a favorable outcome to your admonitions to the Crown in England, and maybe even Scotland. If I were to design a first English presence in the Highlands, I would encourage you to consider establishing an outpost here in the Tafos district, and another one east of Rowan near the edge of the Highlands. Embla sighed and looked down slightly with some despair. We simply cannot do enough with the people and resources we currently have. We are of like mind, Embla. Kenrick was stern. We have discussed this matter as well, and are nervous about suggesting we stretch the king's generosity to such an extent based upon a 2-day meeting with very little confidence of future success. Let it be of some comfort to you that England sees the North as an immediate threat, and we also have little hope in the Scottish crown and nobility to thwart the Viking invasion. Depend on me and my colleagues to entreat the king and his court to see the wisdom in developing a strong military presence in the Highlands, and we will also make sure that both of the genders will have increasing equality in all of our endeavors, even though that may be one of the most difficult aspects of our agreement to fulfill. Please be patient in all the matters at hand. We will need to make stops along the way to meet with British officials and noblemen to garner additional support and counsel. I know that time is of the essence, but there are certain things that must be done in such a way as to help ensure our success. Those things can take longer than we might desire in a perfect world, and London is a long way from here, even with a fast horse. I cannot leave without telling you that you have touched my heart, and I ask you to await my return even more than you await the news that we will bring. In all truth, I would choose to stay now and not return to England, save for the immense importance of this undertaking we share. At this statement, Embla looked up at Kenrick's face with awe. I agree. We are of like mind, Kenrick, and yes, I will await your return with all of my heart. I feel that all will be well, despite the difficulties that even the most fruitful life must endure. Kenrick reached out to her and they clasped hands. Till we meet again, Kenrick. Kenrick nodded and departed to the inn. More than 2 months passed and yet no news came from England. It was not till the end of summer that news came to Rowan from Tafos that a message had come from England that all was well and that a large company of English businessmen, lords and ladies would be arriving in less than 2 weeks. A meeting time would be sent to Rowan when the English arrived. Much harvesting and preparing for winter was already underway, and 2 weeks' time certainly for the completion of many of the more important tasks. When the ambassadors from Rowan left for Tafos, Embla and all of her close friends went with her. Tryggve and Leafy, Aaron and his entire family, Ethrig and Coira and their families. Many other villagers joined to help set up camp and provide service and friendship to all those at this second council with the English. When the council began the day after the Rowans arrived, the rain during the night had cleared and there was a warm sun shining on the mud puddles in the village square. The English had come in large numbers and had set up a fairly large presence in the woods just outside of town with festive tents and large outdoor facilities like a kitchen, dining area, and corral. Kenrick stood on a wagon drawn to the center of town and read from a proclamation bound in a large leather folder. The proclamation informed the people of the Tafos district of the Scottish Highlands that England would be assisting the area with people and resources to pursue the mutual goals of economic and military success. The proclamation was designed as a strict administrative instrument with no provision for negotiation for the time period of 2 years. The economic stipulations in the proclamation were not as advantageous to the Tafos district as they had wished for. They were a start. For the moment, they were all just glad to have a new opportunity and the hope of increasing benefits. The English made up for the predictably less than equitable trade valuations by providing much needed equipment and technology for the mills, production of cloth, farming, and brewing. The military parts of the proclamation were the most beneficial to the Tafos district. 2 outposts would be constructed, one near Tafos, northeast of the village, and one near the eastern part of the Highlands, northeast and across the lake from the village of Rowan. All of the expense for the materials and workers involved in the construction would be borne by England, which meant many new people moving to the area and paying jobs for some of the locals. The last part of the proclamation was that no discrimination would be made against anyone regardless of gender or heritage, and that avenues of recourse and litigation would be established to help foster, strengthen, and enforce the excellent work of equality started in the area of Rowan and the Tafos district. The proclamation ended with the statement that all provisions were effective immediately upon the completion of the public reading of the proclamation, and it was signed by the king himself. This conclusion met with much cheering and applause. After the proclamation was read by Kenrick in its entirety, it was then placed on a covered stand in the center of town, covered by sentinels, so that anyone who cared to would get a chance to read it for themselves. These were ceremoniously presented to both Embla and Fergus with handshakes, embraces, and a few tears shared among the emissaries from England and the Highlands. And by mid-afternoon, the entire town had gathered in and around the English encampment. All of the English people there were given special treatment, and everyone enjoyed the preparations with glad heart. Most of the English had come prepared to stay to begin with the improvements of the farming and manufacturing infrastructure, as well as the groundwork for the English outposts. Winter was coming, and much heavy work had to be done before the first snows. Music, dancing, and the excitement of the celebration went on into the night, and the weary revelers found little joy in the crowing of the roosters the next morning. Some of the English left with diplomatic missions to the Scottish nobility to the west and south. Some went back to England or the south of Scotland. Most of the English that stayed in the area were assigned to either the Tafos or Rowan outpost. The English in Tafos stayed in the encampment they made when they arrived, but would construct some rustic shelters to replace the tents that would surely not survive the winter. The English going to the area east of Rowan were to be led by Kenrick, and they left with many wagons of tools and supplies. The groundwork for the outpost there was already designed, but would probably not get far before the weather would halt its progress until spring. So they too would have to build shelters to survive the winter. Embla and the Rowans left Tafos with the English assigned to their area, and Fergus rode with them a considerable distance, loath to separate in the light of this new sense of companionship. When the citizens of Rowan reached a crossroad near the lake where they would go west and the English would go east, Embla dismounted from her horse and signaled for the other Rowans to follow suit. Those in wagons halted beside the road. The road going east was more like a rustic path, and Triggev gave them guidance regarding the route and landmarks that would get them to their destination in the most efficient way. They all stood abreast and looked at the English. Embla told the English that it was here they would part ways, but that workers from Rowan would be arriving at the designated area in less than a week to stay and work with them on the construction of the outpost. With waves and salutations, the English headed east with Kenrick near the rear of the line. As Kenrick trotted near Embla, he halted his steed and dismounted. He looked at her, put his hands on her shoulders, and looked at her face. "When will I see you again, Embla?" she replied. "In less than a week." Smiling and seemingly relieved, he got back on his horse and rode to the front of the wagon train. 6 days later, Embla and many Rowans left the village in a small wagon train of their own. They were preparing to stay with the English and complete what work they could for as long as the weather held out. Embla and Aaron were at the head of the lineup, fitted in somewhat rustic but proper military regalia. Behind them rode a young lady bearing the banner of the village they had designed with a rowan tree in the middle of a radiant sun. There, near the site of the new outpost, they set up camp and started life over yet again. One day, Kenrick and Embla were having lunch and the subject of military operations came up. "Embla, you have some renown in the battlefield, but how about the others from Rowan? You can see that the men we have brought from England are true soldiers, but their wives and other ladies we have brought with us are not." Kenrick continued. "The work at hand is pressing. However, I would like to start some military training and drilling before the onset of winter. You are dear to me, and I grow more fond of you with each passing day. That fondness is also tied to my respect for you and the values we both share. Here I must confess that my faith in female soldiers is less than you may wish it to be. I have never fought alongside a female with a sword or bow, and I must confess that in this I would also appreciate some training for myself and my soldiers. Will you help me design and institute a new military training regime? If we start it now, maybe one day a week, We can still train and plan, even during the winter. Pray tell me, what do you think? Kenrick bit into an apple and awaited Embla's response. Yes, Embla began. We need to start military exercises as soon as we can. The construction projects have an unavoidable urgency, yet to be caught off guard by a Viking incursion might render all of what we are doing pointless. I think by now your soldiers have seen how all of the women, both English and Rowan, can work with them side by side. The natural parts of how men and women interact socially is a challenge, but if we can be successful in farming and crafting and building, then we certainly can use that same separation of private life and public service to create a powerful military force. I do have a sword, but I have no formal training and I have desired it, as I wonder if I have only been lucky in the few fights I've been in. I'm convinced that military training must be required for everyone. Have you seen my sword, Kenrick? Kenrick shook his head. I will get it and show it to you. Embla retrieved the sword from her tent and presented it to Kenrick, who held it with some amazement. Embla, the sword is magnificent, but how did you come to possess it? Kenrick inquired. Embla went on to tell of the dream she had, the finding of the sword and the weapons cache looted from the village. She described her love for the sword and what it symbolized to her and her people. Kenrick was fascinated. Embla, Kenrick said, I am quite sure that I myself have beheld this very sword before. My family is of a line of military men with strong business interests, primarily in textiles and publications. If I am not mistaken, this very sword was crafted in London for my grandfather as a gift to a Scottish wool merchant. I remember it only vaguely, as I was very young when I saw it, only for a brief time, but I very much desired to have it for my own. My father let me touch the handle. I had given up hope of ever seeing it again. May I draw it out? Embla nodded. Kenrick stood and drew the sword from the sheath. Indeed, Kenrick said slowly as he turned it over in his hand. Indeed. Kenrick sheathed the sword, got on one knee and handed the sword back to Embla. Embla, my whole life has been around military planning and exploits and being a part of the family business ventures. But since I have met you, I find my focus on these subjects has become fuzzy. I never considered having a wife or family, but now I feel that I want that with you. Not just a wife or family, but a wife and a friend, family and a team. Will you marry me? Yes, Kenrick. Embla blushed. This is on my mind in many of the same ways as yours. Our time here on earth is short. Let us now make this bond of friendship and matrimony and be true to what our hearts have already told us. I have thought about this, Embla, as you can tell, Kenrick confessed. I would like to have a ceremony here with our friends in this land, and then maybe next year we can travel back to London to visit my parents. Embla was beaming. They embraced and kissed, a new and wonderful experience for them both. Memories, joy, and pain flooded Embla's mind, but most importantly, through it all, she knew she was grateful. And so it was that Embla sent word back to Rowan with news of a day to celebrate the marriage of Embla and Kenrick. Word spread to Tafos and throughout the land, and a huge gathering tent and gathering area was set up next to the lake. They were blessed with a favorable autumn day, and they were married with a grand celebration in Rowan. Construction of the outpost began in earnest the following spring, and news of the English presence brought dignitaries and inquiries from the Scottish crown. Deals were struck, and even the most stubborn men and women would eventually respect the wonders of the new world right in their own backyard. Embla and Kenrick stayed at the outpost together. They built a lodge of their own. In the next 5 years, Embla and Kenrick had 2 children of their own, a girl, Alice, and a boy, Adam. These children were very healthy and exceptional in many ways, just like Embla. Many friends and villagers around Embla died from old age or disease as well. Her friend Ethric died after her last child was born, and Cora was always in pain from years of hard work making clothes. Word came to Kenrick that his father wished to see him in London, and Kenrick was granted permission by the crown to leave his post for the visit. Word of Embla and her work and social improvements had made her something of a mythical hero in parts of Scotland and England. Even the Norse had heard of her in the Highland armies, so they were mindful and nervous about engaging them. Kenrick and Embla decided to make this a very powerful visit by inviting many businesses and community leaders to accompany them to England with the hopes of sharing ideas and building relationships that would enhance trade practices with the Scottish Highlands and influence social practices in England and eventually beyond. Kenrick's family was active in manufacturing and trading in England, and so their plan was sent ahead to Kenrick's father of their intentions. Aaron, Tryggve, Leafy, and Cora with her husband would all join Embla and Kenrick and their children on the long long journey to London. Along the way, they stopped in Tafos and picked up Ferguson, his wife, and 2 small children, along with a number of other men and women committed to promoting Highlands customs and product, along with learning from the English the most modern technology in business and military concerns. It was almost 500 miles to London, and they made many stops to befriend and engage the various communities they visited. When they finally arrived in London, it was overwhelming to the Highlanders. Kenrick prepared them for what they were about to see, but that did not do the experience justice. A long wagon train of road-weary dignitaries from the north was also a sight to behold for the English. The people from Tafos and Rowans sat tall in the saddle, and 2 horse riders carried the banners of their villages. A contingent of English soldiers dressed in their finest regalia met Kenrick, Embla, and the rest of the Highlanders, then escorted them through town until at last they came to Kenrick's family home, the Addison estate, which was just on the outskirts of London, next to a small river and adjoining woodland. Kenrick's father was overjoyed to meet his new daughter-in-law and grandchildren. Kenrick's mother was grievously ill, and it was thought to be cancer or some other internal disorder that could not be treated. She was delighted to meet Embla and the children, and they all spent time together every morning as long as the mother was feeling up to it. Kenrick's father beheld Embla's sword, and to his own astonishment, confirmed that it was the one his father had made for a high noble Scottish businessman and politician, but he never returned to London. Over the next month, Embla met with all of Kenrick's family, and his brothers were very excited to show the entire Highland entourage their clothing production locations and publication shop. They also met with community leaders and spoke at small gatherings espousing the proven virtues of gender equality. Even though London was very big to the Highlanders, it seemed less progressive than they had hoped. There were some improvements in weaponry in the military, but the business practices seemed quite ineffective to the people from Tafos and Rowan. Kenrick's brothers began right away improving the conditions in their shops after the Highlanders showed them the impressive production numbers and results of their operations in the remote area of Scotland. Clean, organized workshops with thoughtfully designed workflows and production goals were essential to make efficient and profitable use of resources in the Highlands, and those concepts could be used at an even larger scale in London. Embla told them that men, women, and even children working in the shops must be well cared for and not overworked to ensure low employee turnover and absenteeism. By the time the Highlanders left London, there was a fire kindled in the hearts and minds of all the Londoners that had met them. The new design. London in the south and Tafos district in the north put England and Scotland on the map. As the years went by, ships left England and Scotland carrying new goods and ideas whose benefits were valued and magnified all over the world. The concept that women were somehow second-class citizens became outdated and eventually forgotten in every corner of the planet. The Vikings continued to be a pestilence in Scotland, but slowly they too were defeated and driven back home. Embla and the people at the outposts were a confounding presence to the Vikings. Embla's sword was eventually used in both defensive and offensive military action. A few Vikings actually left the coast in search of better lands inland, but when they were confronted by the Highlanders, some retreated back to the coast. The Vikings were eventually defeated and some escaped back to Scandinavia. The Vikings that did stay slowly assimilated and eventually adopted the Highland Scottish ways of business and community. The villages of Tafos and Rowan grew to be towns, well planned and managed, and many people came from all over to trade and learn with the Rowans and the people from the Tafos district. Kenrick and Embla were always kind to one another and had 2 more healthy children. Embla was a dedicated and attentive mother who passed on all of the memories she could, as well as the Scottish lore Brigga had shared with her. Kenrick's father and mother passed away and left him with a sizable inheritance. He collaborated with his brothers and established a trade school and college in London with low tuition and generous scholarships for those with no financial support. Kenrick had some of the money brought up to him, and he developed the first schools in the Highlands, which were open to all. Soon it was a decree that children could only work 4 days a week, and that 2 days were devoted to study and 1 to rest and recreation. When Embla's daughter Elith was 16, she and Embla decided to go with the group, taking 2 wagons of cloth and other goods to Tafos at the end of the week. Her son Adam dearly wanted to go, but Embla told him that he must stay as the trip was mother-daughter time, and that in their absence he would have father-son time with Kenrick. He would go on another trip to Tafos. Maybe the entire family would go, and that made Adam feel much better. Aleth and Embla started to pack clothes and other supplies. Embla's sword was in the corner of the room, and Aleth picked it up. The sword, a legend in the area, and a symbol for struggle and freedom, was revered by Aleth. She loved to hear Embla tell her about the dream, how she found the sword, and how Embla learned how to use it. Embla taught Aleth and Adam how to use and care for the sword and sheath. Sometimes Embla would let Adam or Aleth use the sword in the required military training exercises. Aleth held the sword and asked Embla, "Mother, may I actually carry the sword on our trip to Tafos?" Embla saw the seriousness of the desire in her daughter's eyes and said, "Yes, of course. This sword will be yours someday, as you know, and Adam will get your father's. You might as well get used to carrying it. I will take my dagger, as it is much more comfortable for me these days." She smiled. Aleth hugged and thanked Embla and strapped the sword on right then and there, just to see how it felt again. A light mist dampened the air the day Embla and Aleth set off to Tafos along with the others. 3 wagons there were, along with a couple of horse-drawn carts in the lead. They were all in fair spirits despite the mist and low clouds which were common in the spring. Embla and Aleth bade Kenrick and the other children goodbye and embraced them before they got into their wagon. They were in the last wagon. It had some bundles of cloth they could sit on, and the wagons and carts were covered with tarps just in case a true rain began to fall. Upon arriving in Tafos, there was much joy at Embla and Aleth's visit. Fergus was getting older, but was still quite fit and had become more jovial as his advanced years and station in life allowed. The week at Tafos was busy and productive and went very quickly. Embla shared much time in the evenings with Fergus and his family. Fergus was not only a father, but now a grandfather. He had an estate of sorts with family lodgings and barns built nearby for his children and their families. One family and 2 of his children still lived with Fergus. One was a young man, 2 years older than Aleth. Fergus and Embla watched the youngsters talk by the fire after everyone else had gone to their own homes. Aleth was showing Fergus's son, Embla's sword, with pride and stars in her eyes. Embla and Fergus looked at each other and chuckled. "Thank you, Embla," Fergus said as he looked at her. "Thank you as well, dear friend," Embla said as she raised her mug. "It was your trust and friendship. Where would we be without that?" They toasted and drank, then retired to their beds, leaving the youngsters to chat just a bit longer, quietly, and then go to their own beds, alone. The following morning, the Rowans started the trip home with favorable and pleasant weather, but the travelers were weary and remorseful that they did not have the energy to enjoy it more. After a couple days, they were on the last leg of their trip, and the mist returned along with a mild breeze with warm undertones. Fearing rain, the convoy stopped near some woods to cover the wagons and carts with tarps. The loads were much smaller on the return trip, so the work was done rather quickly. The drivers gathered together and assessed the weather conditions. There was still plenty of daylight. Dark, ominous clouds were gathering, but the rain was more of a mist. The other riders were gathered under the trees and chatting amongst themselves when up from the road they could hear and then see a masked rider on horseback coming towards them at top speed. The rider stopped and looked at the Rowans and laughed. "You are mostly women," he said. "Stand and deliver." Out from the woods came 2 other men on horses without masks, one with a sword and one with a spear. Slowly and menacingly they approached the Rowans. The Rowans were taken off guard and in shock. Embla motioned to Aleth to duck down out of sight behind some bushes. Embla replied, "We are standing, but what would you have us deliver?" "This is no time for games," the masked rider said. "You don't have to deliver. We will just help ourselves." One of the 3 walked up to a wagon and pulled the tarp back. "It's just bags of stuff, like seed and some tools," he shouted to his comrades. The masked rider dismounted and walked over to Embla. "You, woman with the mouth, show us the money or we will kill you all and find it for ourselves. In fact, we might just kill you now and save us some time." He took out a knife and held it to her throat. "Young man," Embla replied, "I can tell by your voice that you are not from around here. In fact, you sound like you might be from the south, maybe even England perhaps. You don't know us, but we are simple traders going home with goods from a visit to the large town south of here. We don't have any money. We spent it. But if you return with us, we can provide you with some food and supplies. Maybe even show you and your friends here a better way of life." The masked bandit took down his mask and growled at Embla. "I told you no games." He slapped her across the face and Embla crumpled down to the ground. That was the signal Alice was waiting for. She leapt from her hiding spot with sword drawn and plunged it into the bandit's chest. Embla got up with dagger in hand and pushed him aside as Alice withdrew the sword. Just as the bandit's body turned and fell away with blood pumping out of his chest, a spear glanced off his body and caught Embla in the stomach. The spear thrower was momentarily disarmed, and the Rowans descended on him and stabbed him to death even before he could draw his sword. The last bandit tried to run away, but Alice grabbed the spear from Embla's side and threw it directly into his back, and then she ran after him as he fell and hacked his head off with her sword. With anger and tears in her eyes, Alice ran back to her mother and found her surrounded by the other Rowans. A warm rain was starting to come down now as Alice knelt beside her mother. "Mama," Alice whispered, "I love you." She smiled and sobbed as she gazed upon her mother, her friend and her hero, now dying in the mud. "Alice, Alice," Embla spoke. Her voice was shaky and her clothes were getting soaked with blood and rain. "This is the way the world is sometimes, but never accept it. Never let it take your heart away from what you know is good and true. Be strong and determined to never give up, and always make sure men and women are treated equally everywhere you go. Will you promise me that?" "Of course, Mama, I will. But now let's get you into the cart. Maybe we can get you to Rowans soon and have that wound taken care of, okay? Please. Come on, everyone. Let's get Mama into the cart." Alice looked up at her friends, and they were all kneeling around her and crying. "Look at your friends, Alice," Embla choked and sighed. "They know the truth. I am mortally wounded, I can tell. The spear went in too far for poultice or stitches to mend, but now don't worry. Let it be and hold my hand." Alice held her hand. "Now, my daughter, put the sword in my hand and raise it up." As Alice did so, Embla pointed the sword to the sky, and the rain began to pour down upon them. Embla reached up and grabbed the handle of the sword with both hands now, and held it even further aloft. Alice put both hands in Embla's hands, and they looked into each other's eyes. "So now it's your turn, and I'm proud of you. I'm so proud of you all." Embla looked at each of her fellow villagers, and they all reached out to put their hands on Alice and Embla's. "My grandfather is here now. I've always wanted to meet him. I heard he was a good man." As Embla passed away, the sun came out, and as the Rowan stood up and prepared to take Embla to Rowan, her body was bathed in sunlight that poked up from the clouds, as if to warm and brighten her one last time.